Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show. Coming up today, the National Grid decide not to trigger a blackout plan, which would have seen households paid for restricting their electricity usage. Do your bit, how the government is promising to reduce your energy bills without having to make huge sacrifices. New onshore wind projects could be given the green light, with talks of a U-turn on the ban following pressure from MPs. And cleaner roads, the latest on plans for London's ultra-low emission zone to be expanded to the whole city. But is it fair on drivers? Hello and welcome to the Daily Climate Show, where we track the changes to our world and interrogate some of the potential solutions to the climate crisis. The National Grid has decided not to enact an emergency blackout plan today. That would have seen households across the country being paid for limiting the amount of electricity they use. Forecasters projected a large drop in the amount of power that would regularly be available from France. Although emergency procedures aren't going ahead, suppliers are still warning that the power supply will be tight in both Britain and France tonight, meaning both countries will need to import power from abroad. Let's take a look at how the system would have worked. Well, the Demand Flexibility Service, as it's known, is a voluntary scheme where households can save money by saving energy. Volunteers are alerted when energy savings need to be made, and if they cut their usage, they'll receive money back. Now, Octopus, which is the biggest energy provider taking part, says its customers saved between £1 and £4 in a recent hour-long trial. And up to 100 megawatts of electricity was saved in those trials. That's the equivalent of the output of a small power plant. Well, our climate change and energy correspondent, Hannah Thomas-Peter, is here now to give us more context. Hannah, what would this have meant for us, and indeed, what does this mean for us?
Well, the National Grid's responsibility is to balance the system, to make sure that supply equals demand. And it looked ahead to tomorrow night, where there's that big football match, of course, between England and Wales, about 7 o'clock. It's actually also not very warm, and it has been quite still, so we can't really rely on wind power like we might normally do at this time of year. The other issue is that the French nuclear power stations are really reduced in their capacity at the moment because they're undergoing a lot of maintenance. And so the National Grid has to turn elsewhere. One of the things it might do to plug the gap is to fire up coal power plants, but also it was considering activating this brand new scheme to ask British consumers, those with smart meters who've signed up for it, to reduce their consumption during peak hours to alleviate pressure on the grid. Now, the real issue here came because the grid has said it's going to give consumers and their suppliers around 24 hours notice each time this might be necessary. So it is potentially something we could see more of for the rest of the winter.
And it shows just how unstable things are in terms of our energy.
It does. And, you know, electricity is dealt with on an hour-by-hour, day-by-day basis. The forecasting is very difficult, very technical. Now, the National Grid would say, look, the Demand Flexibility Service is something that we announced at the beginning of October. We said that the scheme should run between November and March next year. Precisely to deal with this situation where there isn't enough electricity coming from Europe. But still, we all sat up and paid attention, didn't we, when the National Grid said, actually, some consumers are going to have to reduce their consumption in order potentially to avoid blackouts.
We certainly did. Hannah, thank you. Meanwhile, the government announced a new £1 billion Eco Plus scheme aiming to support those in the least energy-efficient homes. Now, the goal is for the UK to become energy independent. And although there will be financial support, what kind of action is the government urging people to take at home? Well, let's take a look. Reducing boiler flow temperature from 75 degrees Celsius to 60 degrees Celsius is one example. Turning down radiators in empty rooms is another. And draft-proofing windows and doors so heat can't escape homes is recommended too. Well, Sky's chief political correspondent, John Craig, joins me now with more on this. Hello to you, John. What more can you tell us about this new scheme?
Well, it's a two-pronged attack, really, on energy bills being launched by Grant Shapps, the business secretary. Now, first of all, there is that Eco Plus scheme. That essentially is about home insulation. And the government claims that with the help that they're providing, that'll save consumers around £310 a year. The second part is that advice you've just been talking about, turning down the boilers, turning off radiators in empty rooms, and also drafter excluders, stuff like that. Mr. Shapps was speaking on Sky News today. He claimed to be leading by example. He said he's turned down the boiler flow temperature at his home. He says it's not just your thermostat, this is the boiler itself. It can potentially save you a lot of money. So that is the plan that Mr. Shapps is announcing today. The publicity scheme was vetoed when it was suggested, vetoed by Liz Truss and the then business secretary, Jacob Rees-Mogg. Nanny state, they claimed. Well, it's going ahead now.
And John, there's been talk today of a potential U-turn by the government when it comes to onshore wind. Tell us more about that.
Well, it's that man, Mr. Shapps, again. Yes. What is happening is that there is a bill going through Parliament. Michael Gove, the Levelling Up Secretary, has got a Levelling Up and Regeneration Bill. Now, there's already been a clash with Rebel MPs over house building targets. Now, there's a clash with backbenchers over onshore wind. This is an amendment put down by the former Levelling Up Secretary under Liz Truss, Simon Clarke. And look at some of the names on it. They want to reverse the ban. Liz Truss and Boris Johnson amongst the signatures. So what Mr. Shapps has said on Sky News today, signalling a U-turn, is that where communities are in favour of it, well, sounds as though they can go ahead.
Where onshore wind happens, it needs to happen with local consent. What is being proposed is something which would guarantee that local consent. As I say, I haven't studied all the ramifications of that in terms of the planning changes. We need, and I'll be talking about this more later in the week, I've just spoken to you about measures to reduce energy use. We also need to make sure that we produce more energy, and we'll be doing that.
Well, Rishi Sunak made his views clear on this during the summer leadership campaign when he put out a press release saying plans to relax onshore wind farm ban in England to be scrapped. He said he'd promised plans to scrap plans to relax the ban, providing certainty to rural communities, he said. I want to reassure communities I would scrap plans to relax the ban. Well, sounds as though there is a U-turn on the way in the face of pressure from some of those big beasts on the Tory backbenches, including the two most recent former Prime Ministers.
OK, John, we appreciate your update. Thank you. Time for a look at some of today's other climate stories now. And the Prince and Princess of Wales are set to fly to Boston in the US later this week for this year's Earthshot Prize Awards ceremony. Billie Eilish will headline the Environmental Awards with 15 finalists vying for £1 million, awarded to each of the 5 category winners. The shortlist for the competition, which is in its second year, includes London-based Nopla hard material that makes packaging from seaweed and plants. Now, how big of a priority is tackling climate change for you? Well, a study has found that concerns about the climate crisis was the #1 reason that prompted people in Australia to vote for an independent candidate during the country's federal elections. Australia is heavily reliant on coal, but attempted to give fresh hopes at COP27 this year in a bid to rebuild its environmental reputation. And a survey looking at native mussels which live on the bed of the River Thames has found that their population has declined by 95% since the 1960s. Scientists carried out the study in a stretch of the Thames near Reading and discovered one native species had vanished completely. Mussels are a great indicator of the health of a river's ecosystem, and researchers say the sharp decline could be due to changes in land use along the river or changes in the fish population. Now, the Mayor of London has announced that London's ultra-low emission zone, or ULEZ, will be expanded from August next year. The changes will mean that drivers of older cars who enter the Greater London Authority boundary will face a daily fee of £12.50 for using the city's roads. But is it an effective way of switching drivers over to cleaner vehicles? Well, joining me now is Neil Gregg, Director of Policy and Research at I Am Road Smart, and Quentin Wilson, motoring journalist and founder of the campaign Fair Change. A very warm welcome to you. Thank you for joining us. Neil, to you first, if I may. What do you make of this new scheme?
Well, I think it can't be a surprise to drivers that this is coming, and this is happening in several other cities across the UK, in Scotland, in Bristol, for example. They've launched a similar scheme with the same kind of standards. So I think we knew it was coming. I think what we didn't expect was such a large area of London to be covered. Once you start moving away from the central areas where there's very good public transport alternatives, it starts to make less sense because you're not giving a clear message to people as to what you want them to do. People will still need to have cars to move around the whole of London. That's absolutely certain. The mix of journeys cannot be replicated by public transport. So we are very concerned that this bigger area will actually lead to more people having to continue to use their cars, and that's going to cost them £12.50 every single day, 365 days a year.
Quentin, your view on the extension of this scheme, Neil's saying there that it could lead to more people using cars. What would you say to that?
We have to do something about the air quality in London because we all know it's dire. And the strong messages being sent out are important. The timing of this is regrettable in the middle of a cost of living crisis, but we need somehow to get these old polluting diesels off the road. And it's the pollution you can see. It's called ultrafine particles, PM10s, PM2.5s. And there's a haversack of research that says there's a connection, a direct connection between cancer and Alzheimer's and a raft of other diseases. So it's not a great time to be doing this, but we have to do it because we know that 50% of all pollution in inner urban areas comes from transport, and the bulk of that from old, badly maintained diesel vehicles.
Neil, what do you say to that? You know, it's not a great time to be doing this with the cost of living crisis, but we have to do it. Would you agree that by August next year, this will be a viable option for drivers?
Well, for some drivers, it will be. That's the problem. For many people, particularly with the older petrol vehicles, they'll be very old. You have to have a very old petrol vehicle to follow these new regulations. But you could have had a newer, relatively new diesel bought since 2015. And of course, you may have well maintained that. You may have looked after it. And of course, you may have maybe your company vehicle, your van, for example. And that's the problem with these sort of big measures. They're very blunt instruments. They don't take into account people's incomes, people's need for the car, people's alternatives. And also, we're getting some mixed messages at the moment as well, because we're starting to see vehicle excise duty going on to electric vehicles, for example. Now, if the government really wants people to get into electric cars, they should be looking to make sure that they make those incentives for electric cars even better, as well as having these controls on our older, more polluting vehicles at the same time.
And Quentin, do you think there are enough incentives and support in place for people to move to greener vehicles?
No, and I think the government is thinking, well, look, it will organically, the market will organically get better and better. It still needs support because the price of these electric cars are high and the price of electricity is high. I've been campaigning for getting the government to reduce the VAT on public charging from 20% to 5%. But we also need things like free parking across London for electric cars, maybe use of priority lanes or bus lanes for low polluting and electric vehicles. So there's a lot of things that both the government and Transport for London could do to make it more palatable. And, you know, the battle for clean air isn't over yet. And electrification, it's being challenged at the moment by a raft of economic factors. So, again, less stick and more carrot.
And Neil, just briefly, before I let you both go, the ultra-low emission zone was first introduced in 2019. What difference has it made?
Well, it's certainly brought in a lot of income to TfL, and I think that's one of the issues here as well. If they could show more clearly the benefits of where this income's going, fewer potholes, more cycle lanes, cheaper public transport, make that direct link between money they're taking from older polluting vehicles and new ideas to make transport cleaner and to make it easier and cheaper, then people might be more supportive. But as I say, the bigger the area gets, the more that link is broken and the more it's more difficult for people to actually give up their vehicles.
OK, Neil Gregg, Quentin Wilson, it's been a pleasure speaking to you both. Thank you for joining us today on The Climate Show. Now, and a reminder, you can watch Tom Heap's Climate Show on Saturdays and Sundays. That's at 3:30 in the afternoon or at 7:30 in the evening. But for now, that is all from us for today. We'll see you again at the same time tomorrow. Thanks very much for watching. See you then.